we are here with the very first episode of Behind the Cards. Um, I think my glasses need cleaning. Everything looks foggy, so just bear with me. So, the very first place I start for myself as a creator, and for those of you who don't know, I have actually created 7 decks, five of which are now in the marketplace, one of which got cancelled 3 weeks or 2 weeks before it went to print, and one deck that comes out this summer, which is the Fairy Wheel Tarot. But those are just the ones that you saw that landed a contract. I've actually designed, wow, so many decks, because not every deck that you pitch is going to get a contract. Not every idea that you come up with is going to make sense for a tarot. And in fact, one of the decks that I did create was a priestess deck. And when I sent the pitch in, my editor, Barbara Moore, was like, you know what? I don't think this works as a deck, but could you take this idea and put it into a book pitch? And that's where Tarot Priestess came from. So the thing about tarot ideas is you need to have quite a few of them and they don't all land. So even though I've had 7 successful ones that did actually make it to contract, there were lots and lots that you never saw or that never went anywhere. So let's talk about the process of where I actually start before I go any further. So the very first thing that I do is, and I've got a whole bunch of stuff on my desk, so let's just get through this. The very first thing I do is I go back to the original story of the tarot. Now, for those of you who have been on any of my lives and you've seen me interviewing other tarot authors, you know that I'm actually not a massive fan of the Rider-Waite-Smith deck. And by that I mean I have problems with the art. I don't connect with the artwork at all. Um, but the one deck that I can tolerate is actually the circular one. So the Tarot Original 1909 circular deck is one that I can tolerate a little bit. I think it's just because of the shape. I have this thing about circle decks. I kind of really like them. So I go back to the original deck because you have to start, like, all tarot decks are based on the original story. So I go back and I familiarize myself with the original story, the original telling of the 78 cards. And I do that by immersing myself into the many stories inside the deck. And there's a couple of different ways you can look at the stories with the minor arcana. But with the major arcana, and there's probably a couple of different ways you can do it with the majors too, but with the major arcana, the very first thing I go back to, and I'm actually going to write all this down as I do it, ooh, is the Fool's Journey. So I want to have a look at the Fool's Journey and all of those 22 cards. So there's 22 cards. There's 22 cards that make up the Fool's Journey. And I go back and I go over the actual story of the Fool's Journey, and I have told that story a couple of different times, and I've written about it a couple of different times, and I've written about it multiple ways. And I teach the Fool's Journey a lot. I teach the Fool's Journey at least 4 times a year in different places and spaces. So it is a story that I'm really familiar with, but I want to go back over it again. Like, I want to see how I can retell this story again and in a way that I have never told it before. So, having said that, I already have 7 contracted decks, that means I've told this story to the world 7 times already. Right? I've told this story 7 times before. I've told it with the Animal Totem Tarot. I've told it with Cirque. I've told it with the mermaids. I've told it through Soul Cats. I've told it through the Unicorn Tarot and through the Fairy Tarot and through the Angel Tarot, which is the one that you guys may never get to see. So I need to think about, how do I tell it again? How do I tell it again in a way, I haven't personally told it. So I need to go back to this original story and think about how do I tell it again. So that's like step one for me is going back and looking at the original story. And then I move into the suits. Now, the suits I've designed two different ways, and it does sometimes depend on the theme, how I go about doing the story of the suits. We'll get to the theme in a minute. In the actual original deck, the suits are broken up into four main stories, okay? So the suits, they have four stories. So they have four stories, right? There's the Fool's Journey, which is one story, and then there's four stories being told in the original Rider Waite Smith deck. And those stories go from the aces to the kings. From the aces to the kings, that's a whole journey. It's a whole story. So there's the story of the cups, there's the story of the pentacles, the story of the swords, and the story of the wands. So already within the tarot deck itself, there's five different stories that we have to tap into and retell. There's five storylines. So if we were doing a very basic outline, we would have five different acts, and that's how we would start thinking about the story of the deck itself. Now, sometimes I do it that way, but most times I do not. So my storylines tend to be six acts because I take the court cards and I make them their own story, and that's generally how I tell the story of the cards. I do the Fool's Journey, I do aces to tens for the suits, and then I do the court cards. But that's not how I do it all the time. And this current idea that I'm working on, I'm not doing it that way at all. So I have a lot more storylines to tell. So I have the Fool's Journey, which is story one, and then I'm breaking the stories up into just four cards each. So I'm telling the story of the aces, the twos, the threes, the fours, the fives, the sixes, the sevens, the eights, the nines, the tens, and then the pages, the knights, the queens, and the cups. So I actually now have about 15. So I've gone from the original 5 to now 15. So I added like 10 additional storylines in here for for this particular deck. And the reason that sometimes that's actually a good thing to do is because the minor arcana tends to tell the story of one character in four different ways. So let me explain that a little bit. So let's just look at the aces. So let's say the aces themselves were one person, and this is the way I'm thinking of it, but not as a person. But they're one thing. They're one thing, but they're told from an emotional perspective, a mental perspective, a practical perspective, which would be pentacles perspective, and then from an action perspective. So a doing perspective, right? And that would be the wands. So we actually have four different things going on in our suits. And if we break them up into aces, twos, threes, we're actually looking at telling the story of these aces in four very different ways. And that's through emotional, what did I say? Emotional, practical, mental, and doing. And that's actually what I'm doing for this current deck. I am really getting into the nitty gritty of the psychology of each of the minor arcana as opposed to just telling the story from aces to kings. I want to break it down even more because it fits the theme, which remember, I'm not going to tell you what this theme is, but it fits the theme of this particular deck better in order to dig deep into the psychology of the cards themselves, the different ways that these things can be represented or shown. So that's where I start. Like, that is my starting point, the original stories of the deck itself. Then then after I've done that and I've broken that down and I've figured out how I want to tell these storylines, and I actually have them drafted in a document, nothing fancy. I actually just use Apple Notes for my drafting process. So, but I do write this down. So now I've written down how I'm going to be telling this particular story. I will have, we are telling the story, the Fool's Journey story, the major arcana, and then I will get into how I'm going to be dealing with the minor arcana. And as I'm doing that, I'm also kind of thinking about why I'm doing that. So I'm writing that all down as well. So how I'm doing it, why I'm doing it. Then comes the theme. So the theme is the lens, so kind of like the way that we're looking at this story unfolding. So for example, the lens that I told this deck from was through the lens of mermaid mythology, mermaid storytelling, mermaid archetypes. That was the lens that I was telling the story of tarot through this one. When it comes to Cirque, which was actually one of the more complex structures that I've ever used to create a deck, this one was through a show. How do we tell the story of tarot as an actual show from multiple viewer perspectives? The audience, the cast, behind the scenes, like how do we do that? So I had multiple lenses for telling this one. This one was a little more complex, and I do often wonder if that's another reason it hasn't sold as well as some of the others, because the structure of this deck was very, very complex. The hardest one, I think, for me to create so far was actually the first one, the Animal Totem Tarot, because, and no, this is not a fake copy of this deck. This is actually the Chinese version of the Animal Totem Tarot. And I think one of the reasons is because the animals mean very similar things, and I struggled to come up with 78 animals that had very unique stories that fit the stories of the cards. So this one was actually quite challenging. And the fairy wheel one that comes out in summer, I create, much like the mermaid, I created a whole backstory for that one. I created a mythology. I tapped into mythology. The artist and I worked very closely with myths and legends, folklore, fairy tale, to really build out the nuances of that deck. And the deck that I am currently working on also has a very well established mythology, folklore. It has very strict rules. So these things need to be put into the cards themselves as I start telling those story pieces. So that's where my personal journey begins. And it's a lot, right? Like, I just told you a lot. We haven't even sat down and started to design cards yet. This is all very theoretical. But you need to make sure that whatever lens, which is the theme, you're going to be telling the story of the tarot through, can actually tell the main story, which is the story that the major and the minor arcana are telling. And one of the things that I have seen when people come to me with deck ideas is they haven't really thought about the fact that they actually have to tell this very big, encompassing narrative, that there's multiple threads and conversations happening. What they're thinking is that they can just take something and slap it onto the cards. And although there are plenty of people who do that, those decks are not they're not as user friendly as something that has really thought about how someone is going to visually use these cards as part of a larger conversation, because the cards themselves are parts of a conversation. We are talking with them, we are dialoguing with them. So we need to make sure that the conversation that the images and the meaning has is coherent, it's clear, it's consistent, and it just makes sense, right? It needs to make sense on all sorts of levels. And that can be difficult for new deck creators to anchor in to the structure of their deck. So that's all I'm going to talk about today. I don't want these to be very long, because otherwise then it's just going to be me being really long-winded. So let's just recap what I was talking about today as my personal starting point when I sit down and think about creating an idea for a deck. So the very first thing I start with, and I'm just going to recap, is I go to the original story. So the original story that uh, Pamela Coleman Smith created. And I like to also use this book. And if you've been on this blog for a while, you know this book, The Secrets of the Rider-Waite-Smith book. I do like to go and refer to this because I'm much more interested in Pamela's inspiration for this than Arthur White's. I'm just more interested in hers, because her perspective on how she created the cards and how she designed the deck, to me, is far more fascinating than his. So that's where I start. And then I think about the story narratives I want to tell, the storylines I want to tell. How many storylines do I want to tell? Generally speaking, the most basic story structure is going to be 5. There's going to be 5 different storylines to tell: the Fool's Journey and then the 4 Suits. But in the deck that I'm currently working on, there's 15. There's 15. Just because it's I've never done this particular theme before, and it lends itself for deeper exploration. So if you joined this later, you're watching this on the replay and you have questions, please put them in the comment section below so that I can answer them when I do the next part of this. So the next part of this is like, how do we then put the theme over the top? Once we've picked the theme, how then do we actually mesh those two different ways of dealing with the cards together, so it is clean, it is coherent, it is easy to read, it is consistent, it is a nice clear narrative. That's what I'll be talking about in part 2. So if you found this really useful, but you've still got questions and you've got more questions about the deck creation process, just put them in the comments and I will do my best to answer them as this series unfolds, because I'm still trying to figure out how I'm going to put this series together and what kind of things I'm actually going to bring to you in this live class. But as I said, I'm not going to tell you about the actual theme that I'm using this time around. Just know that it is different to anything that I've done before, and it's definitely darker than anything I have created before. So if you do have some of my decks, this is going to be vastly different. All right, everyone, thank you so much for joining me live, and thank you for watching the replay. And I will see you in the next series of this, the next part of this, which I'm hoping to do next week, but we'll see how my schedule goes. All right, everyone, thank you so much. Happy creating, and please drop your questions in the comments below. Bye for now.